Hello and welcome to another Ben Listering conversation. As you know, each week I have a guest to chat about their life story and career, and this week's guest is no different. My guest today started his career at BRMB in the Midlands, and he was also on stations such as Radio Aire, and he was also a big player in the Chrysalis Group as managing director of Heart in Birmingham and the sister station Heart in London, and he probably worked with along the lines Francis Currie, the legend that is Francis Currie, and you can now find him on Boom Radio. It's the one, the only. He's one of the brainchilds behind Boom Radio. It's the one, the only, Mr. Phil Riley. Hello, Phil. Welcome along.
Ah, Hi Ben, good to be here. Hope you're doing well.
I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm very good.
Nice. And yeah, it's good. And you were also behind, let's just reel it off here, Orien Media as
Orion,
well,
yes,
with Mr.
Orion Media.
Lloyd as
Yeah,
well. And yeah, it's
yeah.
all good. And you were also part of the, as I said before, Chrysalis Group as well. So it's all good. So I'm just going to shut up and let you talk. So where did it begin for you?
Well, it began for me, as you say, professionally back in 1980 at brmb, where I was fortunate enough to be a graduate trainee. I'd been at Loughborough University for 3 years and had spent more time at the university radio station than I'd spent on my chosen subject. But when I finished at Loughborough, I wanted to get into the radio business, and I was lucky enough to get a break at BRMB where they had, I think it was 4 slots for trainees that year, and I managed to get one of them, and that was the start of my career back in 1980.
With greats such as at the time, probably Les Ross, I'm tempted to say Les Ross
Yeah,
was one of them.
Les was there. I mean, the other people who were there at the time, apart from Les, were Ed Doolan, who was doing a sort of early evening news phone-in show. Tony Butler was doing the sport, he was very famous at the time. Lots of other presenters who people of my vintage will remember. Roger Day, who's now on Boom Radio, of course, but also Nicky Steele, no longer with us. Robin Valk, who's no longer with us. Brendan Kearney, who's still around. Lots of very, very big radio presenters of the time. So it was a great learning experience for me, and I spent a year doing the traffic news and editing bits of tape and writing scripts for people, and eventually managed to get my own show on the station at the end of that year.
Nice. And what was that like your first show? Because I'm assuming it was in Broad Street at BRMB.
No. This was long before Broad Street. This was back in Aston. The station was on Aston Road North, um, opposite the HP Sauce Works, which is very famous because every Thursday the sauce works would make the HP sauce, and the smell of the HP sauce would waft across the whole of Aston. So you could always tell when it was a Thursday. No. So this was it was the old ATV Studios building, which had been converted back in 72, 73 when B&B got the license. And yeah, this was I mean the very first show I did. I did a couple of overnight shows, 1 till 6 in the morning, and then I got a break doing afternoon drive one day when Roger Day couldn't do it, and I was drafted in to do that, and that was the first show I did when the sun was shining. And then at the end of my year, I got offered a regular daytime show 2 till 4 in the afternoon.
Nice. And what was that like on the daytime, being on the daytime lineup at BRMB?
Well, it was good. I mean, I was 22 at the time, I guess. And I think I did that. I think I did 1 year at 2 till 4, and then was moved to 12:30 till 3. So just a slight change, but still sort of early afternoons. I was the guy that did the show that interviewed the guests that came in. So I would do, if an actor was appearing at the Alex or the Rep in Birmingham, they'd come in and I'd do the interview. Or if somebody had a record out, I'd do the interview. So I've got a collection of pictures of me with famous people of the early 80s. And I think I interviewed Andy Williams. I did the Bee Gees, Who else did I do? Gladys Knight and the Pips, Jenny Agutter. So a lot of showbiz. I did the sort of showbiz early afternoon interviews. So that was good fun and good practice for me.
Jasper Carrot, did you ever interview Jasper
Uh,
Carrot?
I did. I don't think I did a formal interview with Jasper, but I did do. I was the host of a Christmas charity, which was run from the boardroom at brmb. And I was the main host of that, and Jasper was one of the guests. So Jasper came in and did that. But I know Jasper, from lots of other things because obviously he's still very much part of the Midland scene, and so I see him around from time to time when I'm doing stuff in Birmingham.
And obviously, musical legend, radio legend in the West Midlands, a West Midlands legend, Noddy Holder as well.
Well,
Did you?
Noddy was so I don't think I interviewed Noddy while I was there at BRB, but when I started Extra back in '89, Noddy was one of the people that I contacted to come and do a show, and Noddy did a show for Extra every Sunday, I think it was, for the first year and a half while I was there. So yeah, so Noddy's part of the furniture too in my career history.
What a legend he was. And obviously, you say Les Ross as well, who's still going strong on the new BRMB, and he's on your station Boom as well.
He is, yeah. I mean, Les was the breakfast show presenter whilst I was at BRB through the early 80s. Then I left BRB in 86 to go to America to do an MBA. And I came back in 1988 and ended up back with the company. I was tapped up to launch Extra AM, which is the AM service in Birmingham and in Coventry. And the BRB program manager at the time, program director, was Mike Owen, and he was going through. He wanted to make a change at breakfast and make BR&B younger because he knew that the AM service was going to target the older audience. So I was in the fortunate position of being able to offer Les a chance to launch Extra as doing the breakfast show on Extra. So that was when was that? Late 88, yeah, sort of later in 1988. And that was hugely successful.
Nice. And what was it like working in Birmingham? Because it was the first time. And what was it like working in the Birmingham district? Because you had the BBC just down the road.
I love Birmingham. I mean, I'm from Manchester originally, so I lived in Manchester till I was 18. Then I went to Loughborough, as I say, to do my university. So the first time I ever went to Birmingham, it was on a train to go for an interview at BRMB. I knew nothing about the city, so I was lucky in a way to get the trainee role, given that I knew nothing about Birmingham. But I quickly grew to love it. I think it's a most underrated city. People have a very negative view of it, and I think an unfairly negative view because I think it's got great character and charm, lots of self-deprecating humour from the people that live there. Of course, it has transformed itself in the last 50 years. Since I first turned up as a sort of 21-year-old. It's now just a completely different city with vast amounts of money having been spent on refurbishing it. That's not to say there still aren't some poor parts of the city. Of course, there are. All big cities have that, but I do think it's got an awful lot to offer. So I married a Birmingham lady. So my children are half Brummie. So yeah, it's good. And I live just down the road really in Leamington Spa. So I'm not, if I want to go to Birmingham, it's a 30 minutes on the train.
Nice. And it's brilliant. And yeah. And obviously, you were at BRMB for 10 years, on and off 10 years, and then you leave BRMB to go further north to Leeds to the 51 Kirkstall Road to the
Yeah,
mighty Radio Aire 96.3 that started the career of Chris Moyles, Stephanie Hurst,
that's right. And
and the late Peter Tate worked there.
yeah, and James Whale, of course, had
Mr. Whale, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, I was working. at brmb, and by the late 89, early 1990, I've been made the program director for both brmb and extra. So I was running both the FM and the AM, and that was, obviously interesting and challenging, and I was enjoying that. Um, but then I was, somebody picked up the phone to me and said, "Did I want to be the managing director of Radio Air?" And obviously the managing director roles, senior and general management, and obviously, given that I'd been to America to do an MBA, that was obviously what I wanted to do. So I took them up on their offer, although Radio Air was not the same as BRMB. BRMB was a highly well established, successful radio station that was profitable and successful. Radio Air was not that. Radio Air had been a challenging radio station to run for its first 10 years. And when I took over as MD, it was still in a pretty difficult situation. And that took and of course, I took over in 1990, and we had a recession 1990, 91, 92. It was a terrible time. Revenues, were in decline, and so it was a real baptism of fire to go into that situation and try and turn that radio station around. I'm pleased to say I think we did turn it around. 93 and 94 were very good years. The station became profitable. And of course, we launched Magic in 1991, and that became very, very successful on 828. And obviously, it was the name, at least the inspiration for when Bauer bought Melody in London and changed it to Magic. Wasn't quite the same format, but I can lay claim to being the guy that launched Magic in the UK, certainly as a brand name.
And what was that like? And who was, and obviously you had a very young Chris Moyles there at the time, and you had
Chris,
Hirstie as well.
yeah, Chris was doing overnights, and to this day, I probably, you know, do feel that I probably didn't pay enough attention to Chris because I don't think, and I think I probably was this was the right thing to do. Um, I kept a lot of the staff away from understanding that there was a real problem with the radio station, that it was losing money, and a risk of going bankrupt. Um, and obviously, when times are so tough like that, you don't focus on what the guy who's doing the overnight show is doing because you're the managing director of the entire radio station. So I probably, to my annoyance, didn't give Chris the attention that he probably deserved, and he clearly went on to have this amazing career, and I couldn't claim any credit for that because I wasn't particularly focused on him. I was much more focused on, were we going to get through the next month's set of accounts? So that was difficult. There were a lot of great people at Radio Air who were doing their best in a difficult set of circumstances. One of the problems that Radio Air had, which I suspect it still has today, is the frequency 96.3 and the power just weren't very good. And the topography of Leeds is quite difficult. It's a city built in a bowl, and the signal really didn't get as far as it should do. And I spent quite a bit of time in the 3 or 4 years I was there lobbying the then IBA to try and get the frequency up on Emily Moor, which would have given it a much better footprint, but sadly didn't succeed. I imagine that's probably much better now because obviously there'll be a local FM DAB multiplex which will cover the whole of the area much better, and obviously the signal there will be much stronger than the old 96.3 was. So I imagine, in Leeds, I mean, it's obviously not Radio Air anymore, but it's hits, isn't it? But I imagine it's doing, it'll be doing better because of that. But it was a challenge at the time, certainly a challenge to try and run a local radio station where the frequency and the power wasn't quite good enough. And a lot of stations that launched in the early 80s had the same problem. I think if you go back in history and look at a lot of those early 80s launches, Centre Radio was another one. They they weren't given sufficiently good frequencies and power, and I think that hindered a lot of them, and it meant that certainly that period quite a few of the radio stations suffered a bit from not having quite good enough signals. Anyway,
And what
but there were great people there. As you say, Peter Tate was there, Ray Stroud, but a bunch of great guys. It was a good station full of good people trying to do a good job, and
Paul
Leeds is a great town.
Paul Stead as well.
Yeah, Paul Stead, crikey, yes, yeah, no, no, lots of good people there, and I brought my old mate Paul Fairbairn in as program director, and he and I had worked at University Radio Loughborough together. And he'd gone on to work at Pennine, and he was from Leeds, so it was great to get him. And Krista Ackroyd was the original program director when I was there, but she was, working on TV as well. She was on two jobs at the same time. So, yeah, it was great times there.
And what was it like? Did you ever get, because had Whale gone by the time you'd arrived, or
Yeah,
was he
he
just
he oh, he
leaving?
was he was just finishing, and the TV show was taking off, and he was off doing other things. So really, our time hardly overlapped. I mean, it was for a few months. I think when I got there, it would already been announced that he was going. So again, I didn't, probably give him as much attention as I should do because I knew he was not long for this world, and I'd got other stuff to do. Carl Kingston was there. That's right. He was another one. Paul Stead, Carl Kingston. Yeah, it was a good, talented lineup of guys, without doubt. And we did good things, but it was set against difficult financial circumstances going in, and then there was a horrible recession. Those people who were around in the early 90s will remember we had double-digit revenue declines 2 years on the bounce, so it was not good.
Yeah, and it's quite hard. Did you ever go into the ITV complex next door? If you,
I didn't. Oh well, I may have done, but it was not part of what I was interested in. So
because it was an awesome building, the mighty 96.3 building aire, the radio
it,
air
it
building.
it was a great building, yeah, and there were lots of good people in there, and Tim White was heavily involved in news. I can't remember if he was news editor at the time or sports editor, but he's now, if you follow him on Twitter or X, it is now. He does wonderful work covering the Ukraine war. So it's great, and I'm still in contact with him and still support him doing what he's doing. So it's fantastic that there are still people around from that long ago.
Yeah, and obviously, as I say, I was one of the last people to interview Carl Kingston before he passed, and we
Yeah.
were speaking about. He was talking about when I had him on. He was talking about his last broadcast that was his last broadcast going on the Radio Caroline ship and stuff.
Oh, right.
And he was talking about that time, and he was talking about seeing Paul McKenna, looking forward to seeing his old mate Paul McKenna again and stuff from the
Yeah.
Caroline days.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as I say, I enjoyed doing that interview, and yeah, and but Radio Air was an awesome time. But 1994 rolls around, and you decide to leave Radio Air, and you go back down to the West Midlands to Birmingham, and you join Chrysalis as the managing director.
Yeah. So, I mean, what happened there was towards the end of 1993, Chrysalis were awarded the license for the new regional for the West Midlands, and the license was it was going to be a music station. Soft adult contemporary was the format that they won the license with. Um, a couple of other people were actually um, offered the job before me, and I'm lucky that they didn't take it. I know who they are, but I won't reveal the names now. That will be unfair on them. I was quite annoyed to begin with, to be honest, because I thought, well, it should be me. If anybody should be the MD of that radio station, it should be me. So I was a bit miffed that these other people had been offered the job, but luckily both of them turned it down, and so I was the third phone call that Richard Huntingford made. He was at the time he was the director of corporate development for Chrysalis, and Chrysalis hadn't got no real experience in radio. They'd invested in the Metro Group. They'd owned 20% of the Metro Group, but they didn't have any day-to-day actual experience of actually running a radio station. So when Richard called me up and said, "Did I want the job of being MD?" I was literally the first operational employee of the radio division. So that was fantastic because it meant literally building something from scratch, and that was the first heart, and that was in Birmingham. We launched September the 6th, 1994, and that was a fantastic period. Again, a great bunch of people, from all over in terms of sales and programming and news, and it's a great thing to launch a radio station from scratch, and it's a really great thing to build it from nothing. And that experience is just a fantastic experience, and everybody who was involved, I think, would say it was one of the best things that they'd ever done with their careers. We just all had a fantastic time launching that station, and it proved to be very successful. And launched helped launch Chrysalis in terms of its own radio aspirations, and we managed to build Chrysalis from there over the next 13 years into a huge radio group. But it was fantastic to go down as the first employee.
And how did that feel going back to Birmingham in a competitive market at the time?
Well, my wife was very pleased because she was a Brummie. So, and she'd come up to live with me in Leeds, and I'd probably not enjoyed it as much as she enjoyed Birmingham. So it was great to come back down to Birmingham. And obviously, I knew Birmingham very well, and I knew the people. I knew the people who worked in the media there. So I had a lot of contacts to draw on, a lot of people that I could pick up the phone to and say, "Did you want to come and help launch this?" So that was a terrific benefit to me, and obviously I did miss Birmingham. I love Leeds. It was a great city. My eldest daughter was born there, but coming back to Birmingham felt like, for me at least, professionally coming home, and I felt too at the time that I could do a good job there. That actually, we could take it to brmb and take it to Beacon and take it to Mercia and give them a run for their money, and I think we managed to do that.
And yeah, and how did it feel doing that? And did you manage to nick any presenters from BRMB?
I was just trying to think who we nicked. Well, we nicked Carlos, didn't we? I'm not sure,
Yeah.
sure if we nicked anybody else
Phil
before.
Upton?
Yeah, we took those guys. I don't think we had anybody on at launch who was directly from there. I think we had to sort of gather people who'd been in and around the Midlands. Nick Piercy, Nick Wright was at breakfast. Nick Piercy. I'm trying to think who else. Dave Hickman was on. So yeah, there were people who had been there, but there wasn't a direct sort of, we've lifted the guy who's doing mid mornings from BRB and he's coming across to do mid mornings for us. It was, you know, people who were in good positions at the other stations weren't going to leave to come and join a station they didn't know whether it was going to be successful or not. We had to prove ourselves. So we started with people who who fancied having a go. So that was fun. But because I'd been and lived in the States for 18 months, I really believed in competition. I could see what a competitive radio market would do, and that how having radio stations going up against each other was good for both of them, and that actually just having one commercial station in the market wasn't really very good because that station became complacent. And I think we were good for the rest of the commercial radio market in the West Midlands because we forced them to up their game.
Yeah. And you had to get them to up the game because it was a competitive market. And what was your highlights from the Birmingham time? And what was your biggest thing that you took to BRMB? And did you manage to beat BRMB? Because obviously there was the BBC as well down the road.
Yeah, to be honest, I've never really worried about the BBC in my life. I know you mentioned them twice, but I just really, certainly as far as local radio is concerned, they were operating in an entirely different market, appealing to entirely different people who wanted something else from their radio than what we were offering. So I never really worried about what the BBC were doing locally. I'm not saying they were, they weren't important or impressive. It just never occurred to me to worry about them because they were appealing to a different audience. In terms of brmb and or Beacon and us, we we did fairly early on beat brmb in the radar ratings. Now, not directly head to head in terms of market share in their market, but in terms of how big we were compared to how big they were, we overtook them. I'm guessing a couple of years into, maybe 3 years in, we got a bit bigger numbers than them, and that was obviously a big thing in terms of our ability to attract advertising. Um, but it forced them to up their game, and of course they did. They had the great Two Strangers in a Wedding stunt, which and I don't know whether I'm pretty sure they did that directly because of the competition. They felt, Clive, it was Clive and Julie Fair, they felt they had to respond to what the guy down the road, the guys down the road were doing and come up with something that would put them, on the front page of the newspaper and front and center and get people to talk about them. And they came up with Two Strangers in a Wedding, and that was, that absolutely skyrocketed their audience. They did fantastically well out of that. So, that's what I mean by, competition brings out the best of both parties because they were thinking on their feet. What can they do to respond? And they did very well with that as a promotion. So yeah, there you go. That's a good example. But we successfully planted our flag and were very successful. And obviously, it was only a year later that well, in fact, it was only months after we'd launched in Birmingham that we won the London license, and went down to launch London. So that was very soon thereafter.
And I must ask as well, how did it feel going down to London? Because that's another competitive market as well, because you had
Yeah, well, we had Capital down there. We had Melody. I'm trying to think. Melody was still.
Virgin,
Yeah, well, Virgin, of course, were on AM. So when we won the FM license for London, Virgin won an FM license in the same at the same time. Um, what else? Jazz was on FM. I'm trying to think of X. I think XFM came later on FM. My memory is not fantastic about the exact time frame of all these things, but it was a very competitive marketplace. Of course, it was, and I think Heart in London launched well. Um, we probably didn't quite get the right mix at breakfast to begin with. It took us maybe a while. We weren't perfect, and then David Prever took over, and that became, that was better. And then Jono took over, and I'm going through many years now in a very short space of time. Um, and Jono, was another step forward, and then of course we ended up with the wonderful team that I mean, he's still they're still there now. Uh,
Jamie of Theakston,
yeah, Jamie,
who
Jamie.
Fran who Francis Currie gave the gig.
Yeah, I mean, Francis will claim he gave him the gig. I'll claim I gave him the gig. In the reality is we both gave him the gig because Francis had to come to me and get me to sign off on it. So, we can both lay claim to that. And that was, crikey, 2005, 2006,
Yeah.
and 20 years on, he's still there, which is an
And
amazing run.
and he's now beat obviously you had Tarrant down the road doing his thing on Capital
Yeah, at the
because
time, yeah, when we launched that, I think it was a very um, tough thing to do to take on Capital, and it took us longer to beat Capital than it did to beat brmb. And the brmb, when we first beat them, it was a slightly, apples and oranges thing because we were on a bigger footprint. Whereas Hart and Capital both had exactly the same footprint in London, and it took us until 2000, 2001 before we beat them in terms of radar. I remember it distinctly because I was on holiday at the time, and so the radar, whenever the radar numbers came out, I was like 6 hours away in terms of time zones when the radars came out. But I think it was 2001. And I remember trying to call Chris Wright, who was the chief executive of the whole Chrysalis group, to tell him, and he was on a plane going somewhere else, so the time zones and everything. But that was a momentous thing. The first time we beat Capital.
And
Um,
you managed to nab some capital jocks as well. I think Pat Sharp. Did you even manage to nab? I remember from an archive clip, Cara Noble as well, Tarrant's leading lady.
well, Cara worked for us for a while, but obviously that ended in slightly difficult circumstances because Cara, uh, uh, you know, sold sold a picture that she had of Sophie Rhys-Jones, who was going to get married to Prince Edward, and that we had to let her go, and that was a slightly difficult circumstance. But she did work for us, and she worked for us for quite some time, 3, 4 years maybe, and was part of helping build that. So it was a pity that the that show ended in a slightly less glamorous way than you would normally expect shows to people to go out of shows. But there you go. That was just one of those things. But yeah, we had a succession of great people, and as you say, Pat Sharp was there. Scott Mills was a very early signing on Heart and was there for quite some time. Keith Pringle brought Scott.
Gary
Um,
King, Danny
yeah,
Returing,
yeah, a bunch of
Nigel
great guys.
Williams.
Yeah, NJ, yes, who's still there doing jazz, isn't he? So, there's a lot of great people had passed through the Heart in London. It was a fantastic proving ground for many people who've gone on to do other great things. I mean, Scott's doing the biggest show on UK radio, isn't he? And he was on Heart in London for quite some time. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And obviously others have gone on to do great things as well. Pat's still doing well with all of his other stuff.
He is, yeah. No, Pat's a great guy, and got a lot of time for Pat, and he was, he came on and delivered for us, yeah. So good times, great people, great radio station, fantastic launching pad, and the two hearts between them, were a very big part of UK radio in the late 90s and 2000s, and certainly were the underpinning of Chrysalis being a very big radio group.
Yeah, and it's good and it's brilliant. And what year did you leave Hart? Was it 2000? Chrysalis, was it 2007?
Yeah, well, we sold Chrysalis in 2007, and we sold it to Ashley Tabor and the Global Group and Richard Park, and it felt to me that there wasn't really a role for a sort of senior MD, who wanted to do his own thing and run his own ship. That wasn't going to be a job that was really on offer within Global. It was obvious that Ashley and Richard were going to be the driving forces behind that, and they've done a brilliant job with Global and everything that's been that's come through since then with their acquisition of GCAP and all the other things they've done. So it was perfectly logical for me to leave, and it was perfectly logical for them to pick up the reins and build a fantastic group out of what we created at Chrysalis. And I'm very proud of what we handed over, and I know they're very proud of what they inherited and what they've done with it. So it's nothing but good thoughts and good feelings to Ashley and everybody there. But it was right for me. 2007. I'd been there for 13 years. I'd done as much as I could. It was right to sell the business, and it was right for me to pick up my bag and walk out the door and say, right, let's go and do something else.
And what did you do next?
Well, I did. I consulted for a bit. I helped the community corps guys in Ireland, but really I was looking to buy my way back into the radio business, and I had a go at buying the EMAP radio assets, and had got backing from some private equity firms to do that, but we were outbid by our friends the Germans, and the Bauer company put in a huge bid for the whole of EMAP, including the radio business and the magazines. So unfortunately, our bid was We were outbid, but that happens in business, and obviously Bauer have been fantastically successful. So hats off to them. Uh, then we looked at another couple of things, and then as happenstance would have it, global bid for GCAP, and at the end of all of that process, sometime down the way, Global were told they had to dispose of a bunch of radio stations in the Midlands, including brmb and including Heart 106 in Nottingham. And it was a great opportunity for me to see if I could help raise the funds to go and buy those businesses. And I did. And that was what Orion Media was. So the gap, so it was maybe 18 months, 2 years that I was, not running something. And then 2009, we managed to buy those assets back off Ashley and Global, and we ran Orion for 7 years in back in Birmingham.
And what was that like being back in the place you started?
Well, it's funny, yeah. It's like a bad, it's like a bad penny, isn't it? Keep turning up in the same place. Now, by that time, of course, BR&B had moved to Brindley Place to Broad Street. So when we went back in, it felt different. It didn't feel as though I was going into the old BR&B in Aston Road. It felt like it was a different radio station, which that was good. So that was it. It didn't feel as though I was going into something I'd already done, a place I'd already been. It felt as though I was, inheriting something new, and that was great. And we had a great time. Although, I think it is fair to say that traditional local commercial radio of the BR&B and Beacon era was 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 struggling in the early 90s, early and mid 90s. Um, uh, um, Sorry, the early and mid, 2000 to 2010s. Sorry, not the early 90s. And we were fighting an uphill battle, I think, to build and try and build audiences there. And obviously, we, in the end, changed the brand there to Free because we felt that we needed to be able to market a single brand to compete against Heart and Capital, both of whom were there in the West Midlands by that time, and Smooth. And we felt actually trying to run a collection of smaller local brands, different brands, was just too great a challenge, and that actually we needed to be big enough to compete with those regional guys.
And is that when you changed the name to Free? Because
Yeah,
I know that a few people were there, a few previous guests like John Fox and
Foxy. Yeah, Foxy was
Foxy,
there. Yeah,
Simon Monk. He
yeah,
was
yeah,
behind the scenes, Simon
yeah,
Monk, I think.
yeah. We had to do it again. I've been very blessed, I think, with lots of very talented people being in and around the radio stations that I've been responsible for, and there were lots of talented people at BRB during that time. So yeah, we it was a fun time, enjoyable, but challenging, and we did pretty well. Obviously, my job is to be in the back office, counting the pennies, making sure that there's enough money to pay the wages every month, trying to make a profit for the shareholders. Other people like David were obviously closer to the presentation teams and trying to keep the audiences up. But yeah, we had a great time, very enjoyable.
Nice. And it's brilliant. And 2016 rolls around and you sell Orion
Yeah,
Media.
yeah. Sold to Bauer.
Sold
Uh,
to, yeah, Bauer, yeah.
yeah, in the end, it was almost inevitable, really, that those licenses ended up in Bauer's hands. We were lucky in a way that we managed to outbid them back in 2009. But sooner or later, it was an inevitability that they probably owned it, and we sold it to them in 2016. It was a great business deal. We sold for more than we paid to buy it, so everybody walked away happy. The shareholders were happy. The backers were happy. And I think Bauer were happy because they got their hands on these assets that then made their map of the UK look much better. So we all walked away happy with that deal. and I
Nice.
retired. I think that was that the second time I didn't really retire in 2007, but I'd half thought about it. So, but I then retired again in 2016, um, and then I had a phone call from an old friend of mine, Paul Smith, who was uh, the chap that ran Cellar Door and made Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, was a very rich guy, a very successful guy, but he had a passion for radio and he built himself a radio business, Cellar Door Radio, a whole bunch of stations down and around the south of England. And he said to me, would I come on board as just as a non-executive director of the company to just give him some help and advice and guidance on running that business. And I did that. I must have been on the board there for maybe 18 months or so until he sold again to Bauer back in 2019, the back end of 2019. So, I wasn't really looking to get back in the business, but he wanted to do, wanted some help, and I was happy to do that.
And then you obviously, in your outside of your work for that, you obviously established Podcast Live as well.
Yeah, I mean, that I was just, this was a period when I was just doing odd things, and I probably got my dates slightly wrong there because I was with Celador, and I'm trying to think when Celador sold to Bauer. Maybe it was more like 2018, because what happened, people will remember this, is that Bauer went and bought Celador. They also bought UKRD. They also bought Wireless Group's local assets, and they bought Lynx FM. So they bought about 50 odd radio stations. And then the competition authority stepped in and said, "We're not sure you can own all of these. You're going to need to," what the technical term was, put them in hold separate. And so I'd left the board of Celador because Celador had sold the business. And then literally 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, Paul Keenan, who was the big head boss at Bauer, picked up the phone to me and said, "We've bought all these radio stations, but we're not technically allowed to go and run them and control them. We have to find somebody independent to do that for us. Would you go in effectively as the chairman to look after them?" And so I did. So it was a very unusual set of circumstances. I was the sort of non-exec chairman of these 53 radio stations, and every month I'd go around to speak to the MDs of them all, and make sure that everything was okay. But it was very difficult for them because they were having to run, knowing that they would end up with Bauer probably, but they couldn't go and talk to them about anything. They had to come and talk to me. So it was quite a strange situation. But I ended up running, being the chairman of, I suppose, 50 another 50 radio stations. So I've probably had my footprint on more radio stations than anybody else in the UK, I guess, apart from the now obviously global own lots of licenses. But it was quite an unusual situation, and that finished just about at the time of lockdown in 2020. I think Bauer got clearance. So at the same time as all of that, yeah, we were doing Podcast Live, and then that sort of went into a cold storage, if you like, when lockdown happened, because obviously you couldn't do live events. And by the time lockdowns had finished a couple of years later, just really wasn't wasn't a viable proposition, and people had decided that actually could do live podcasting on their own. They didn't need to do what we were doing. So it was a good idea. Just unfortunately, lockdown and COVID probably knocked it on the head. But in the meantime, other stuff was happening.
And as I say, during COVID, you launched one of the greatest radio stations of all time, in my view, one of my favorite radio stations. And because of the lineup of presenters you've had on there,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Mighty with David Lloyd, Paul Roby, Paul
Oh,
Roby as
yes,
well,
yes,
the
absolutely.
Mighty Boom Radio. How did you end up launching Boom, and why? I was chatting in a meeting the other day at a radio conference, and they were talking about the success of Boom because Boom's playlist is successful, and what makes Boom's playlist so successful, and how did you end up launching a brilliant behemoth of a radio station.
Well, lockdown happened, and for the first 3 months, I just finished this thing with Bauer, as I was telling you, that Bauer had just taken control of all of those stations, and I was quite enjoying the first lockdown because I didn't have anything to do, and I was the weather was really, people might remember that for the very first lockdown, sort of March, April, May of 2020, the weather was really lovely. So we had, I was just sitting at home enjoying myself, and then by sort of June, July. I was starting to get a bit bored, and I'd got one or two things in my life, but nothing that was a full-time thing. And then David emailed me, David Lloyd, 13th of July, 2020, and it literally was a very short email. It just said, "Do you know, Radio 2 moving younger definitely means there's a whole bunch of disaffected Radio 2 listeners who'd love a radio station that was just aimed at them. What do you think? Is it a viable commercial opportunity?" And I sort of spent 24 hours in front of a spreadsheet, tinkling away with various things, and I thought actually we could make a go of this. So I emailed him back the following day, and I said, I think there's something here. Let's just work up a business plan over the next month or so. And if we get to the point of having something that we think we could put in front of people and ask them for money, then we'll give it a go. And we sort of worked on the plan for about a month. And David came over to my house, and we just sat opposite each other on the sofa in the living room. This is sort of early September. I said, well, we need to decide, are we going to do this? And if we are, the first thing we need to decide is we're going to have to put some of our own money in, because if we go and ask other people for money, we've got to prove that we've put money in. So you're going to have to go and raid your piggy bank, your pension savings, and find a healthy sum of money. And I said, if you do it, I'll do it. We'll do it together. And so David and Paul found a chunk of money, and me and Jean found a chunk of money, and we put that in. And I said, right, okay, we need to go and talk to a bunch of other people, because we don't have enough. We haven't put enough money in ourselves to do this. We need to raise funds from other people, and that was what we did during the October, November of 2020, was to go and talk to friends, former colleagues, people in the business, um, to see if they would back us. Now, the one thing we didn't do, quite deliberately, we didn't go and talk to a Global or a Bauer or News UK or any of the big guys, because we thought they wouldn't be interested in what we were trying to do, because the idea behind Boom was quite specifically not to be commercial, but it was to create a radio station that would appeal to disaffected Radio 2 listeners. And we just thought, it's not going to be competitive against Gold particularly, or Greatest Hits Radio. Won't take listeners off them. And we don't need to have Global and Bauer. Let's do it ourselves. Let's do it with a bunch of mates. And so that's what we did. And I think there was another 15 or 20 people, said, yeah, we'll put, a bit of cash in. And so we raised the money, and we launched in February of 2021. And obviously at the time, you know, I did most of the phone calls to raise the money, and David did most of the phone calls to get the presenters on board. But at the same time, he placed a couple of phone calls with friends he'd got who got a bit of money, and I placed a few phone calls to presenters I knew. So, we did a bit of both, but he was mainly focused on trying to get the presenters over the line, and I was mainly focused on getting the finances. And obviously, we said to the presenters, "Listen, we haven't got a lot of money. We can't afford to pay you very much. I mean, literally, it will not be more than a few pounds per show. But if it works, we'll up your salary, and if it works, you'll be famous again." And that was, I think, a great calling card for lots of them. Because I think for a lot of them, they'd sort of, I don't mean to be negative, and I don't think they'd take it negatively, but they'd sort of fallen off the end of the conveyor belt. a lot of the presenters have been huge stars, and they'd been on national radio stations or big London radio stations, and they'd ended up somewhere else, and they just ended up in a situation where, the phone wasn't ringing for them, but our phone did ring for them, and I think they were persuaded that, between us we could make a decent fist of this, and that David and I knew what we were doing, and that we could make something that was going to be of appeal.
And I mean, it's successful. You've got legends already on there, and you've even had people such as, I think you've even had Chris Tarrant, Paul Burnett.
Yeah, we try and talk to anybody and everybody, and we think doesn't matter if they work for somebody else or if they've stopped working. If they're known to our audience, let's see if we can get them to do a show, even if it's only one show. And Chris did a show. I think he did a couple of shows for us actually. And as you say, the late Jenny Murray had done a show. I mean, the late Jenny Murray played some Motown, Motown for us, right? How fantastic is that? So absolutely, we had Paul O'Grady. I mean, the biggest missed opportunity, I think, of our 5 years was the tragedy of Paul O'Grady, who had come and, he'd left Radio 2, fallen out with them. He did a show for us at Christmas and it went down fantastically well. And we said, you really should do more. And he agreed. And, we were literally about to launch his show when he died. That was an absolute tragedy for us. But, he did do, he did do a show for us. So, as Paul, and we're happy to talk to anybody, and get everybody to do a show for us.
And I reckon if he was still with us, the late Dale Winton would be doing stuff on Boom.
Well, he would have done. I'd say the other person who would have been fantastic for us, but would have probably wanted to take over the breakfast show, is John Myers. So John, who's absolutely one of my closest friends, died 6 years ago, and he died in this, was it the summer of 2020? I think it was. He died, before we had a chance to talk about Boom, or launch it, and I suspect that actually had John still been around, he would have been an investor. He'd have been on the board. As I say, he'd have been nagging David to put him on the breakfast show as John Morgan. So, lots of people would have been on, I suspect. But Dale, yeah, I'm sure Dale would have been on, yeah.
Because of his connection with David, obviously. And how did you manage? Who was it, you or David, who got Paul Roby on board?
Well, Paul Roby and David, of course, are life partners. So it was pretty easy to get Paul on board. And Paul's the hidden genius behind Boom, really, because it shouldn't work. If you write down on paper, we're going to have a radio station, we're going to fill it full of old DJs, we're going to only give them an hour and a half, 2 hours each, and we're going to, in every hour, play songs from the 1950s through to the 1980s, and we're going to mix them, and there's going to be album tracks and singles that weren't hits alongside big hits. And then if you wrote it down on a piece of paper, you just take a look at it and say, well, that's just never going to fly. But it does work, and it works because Paul is absolutely obsessive on working out exactly where to place one song next to another, and make sure that if we're going to go from the 1950s to the 1980s, there's something in between so that it isn't jarring. He's very, very clever at how
So sorry, he's very clever at how
he's
he.
brilliant. He's brilliant at it, and and I think that's the reason we are successful is because of the music we play and the presenters we've got. But the reason that the music we play works is because Paul, really cares about it, and has just done a brilliant job.
And he can link between the songs. He can find a link between the songs. If you
Yeah,
want.
I mean, I think I wouldn't overplay the linkage. It's much more that such a broad playlist. I mean, we play probably 10,000 in any 3 month period. We probably play 10,000 separate songs, and keeping track of all that is a monumental exercise. So it's just he's just gifted in terms of his musical knowledge, and that's what makes it work.
Yeah, and I know that you've had some, shall we say, criticism from all sides, but I think Boom's a great station. And me and when we were talking about it, when he had his edition, Gavin McCoy, the voiceover
Oh
guy,
yeah, Gavin, yeah, yeah,
he was talking about how successful Boom is, and he thinks it's great that
yeah.
they've got their own piece of kit in their own front room and they don't
Yeah,
have to go into central studios. And he thinks it's great that Roger Twiggy Day can do his show from Spain or Graham Torrington from Spain.
that's right, and that works perfectly. And if you listen to the station, I don't think would you know that they weren't in a professional studio? I don't think you would. Um, there's you know, what we don't do is we don't do phone-ins because that would be technically a bit challenging. But I think that creates a different sound on the station. We have lots of listener interaction. We talk about our listeners. We refer to our listeners. We read out their emails, but we don't have them on the phone. And I think that just gives a bit of a cleaner sound. If that's the if that's the only real technical limitation, for how we do the output, well, it's not much of a limitation, really.
Yeah, and I think it's great, and you get loads of big guests on. Like you've got loads of people who were brilliant on the radio and who were brilliant back in the day and who were brilliant in their day of the radio. And it feels like going back in time because I was listening one day when Chris Tarrant was doing his one-off show and I was just enthralled because he was just playing some awesome
Yeah,
tracks.
yeah, yeah,
Or
yeah.
Paul
No,
Burnett, for example.
he's another guy who will come on and do shows for us, and it's fantastic. And we're grateful for him and for everybody else. And obviously, we've got the guys that do 5 shows a week who are our regular mainstays, but the guys that are just doing 1 or 2 shows a week or even just specials, they're as important to us because they add to this whole, the overall luster of the radio station. So yeah, it's great. We're having a fantastic time. It's been the most wonderful experience. We feel we're making a difference to the lives of our listeners, and that was what we wanted to do when we started. And we're enjoying doing it.
Yeah, and it's brilliant. And I must ask you, over your 30, 40 odd year career, what has been
40,
the
45, 45.
45, 46 actually, because it was 1980.
Quite right, 46. Yeah, we're 46.
46-year career, what has been your highlight and who would you like to say thank you to? And I know that as well, I know that John Simons gave Booman up in his edition as well.
Yeah. Um, well, I've probably got 2 or 3 highlights. Um, uh, I've launched a lot of radio stations. I launched Extra, that was a highlight. Launched Heart, that was a highlight. Launched Magic, that was a highlight. Launching Boom, been a highlight. Relaunching LBC when we bought it in 2002, that was phenomenal. Bringing back a station that had seen better days and that had sort of fallen on hard times, really, and putting it back on FM and making it, a big commercial radio speech powerhouse. That was fantastic. So, though I think from a connection with audiences perspective, those are the highlights. I haven't mentioned Galaxy. We didn't mention Galaxy. Got to mention Galaxy.
Galaxy.
Galaxy was
Stephanie
great.
Hurst will be
Yeah, yeah.
shouting at me.
Yeah, Hirstie on Galaxy, right? The whole Galaxy network, fantastic. So those are, the highlights. Probably out of all of them, the one that, if somebody was going to write an obituary of me, they'd probably mention Heart and Boom are the two, probably, right? Because Heart's the biggest commercial station in the country, and Boom's this fantastic thing that we ended up doing, when we'd all retired. So I suspect those are the two biggest. And in terms of people, crikey, it's very difficult because I have worked over 45 years with an awful lot of the most talented people in commercial radio. Some of them not with us any longer, but I've made great friendships. I've hopefully I've helped a whole bunch of people's careers, and I just love the industry and everybody in it. I mean, obviously, I've got to tip my hat over everybody else, probably to David, because I haven't managed to shake him off for almost 30 years. So we're still together. We started in 1997. Was it in with Radio Air? Not Radio Air, sorry, with Galaxy 105 in Yorkshire. Um, and almost 30 years later, we're still stuck to each other. So that's a pretty good uh, timing. And Don Thompson, who again, Don was my commercial director back in 1994 when we launched Heart in Birmingham, and he's still a board director of Boom. So those two guys have been with me for almost 30 years. And you don't stick with people for that long unless they're great people, and they're great people.
And are we going to ever get a Noddy Holder boom show? Or are we going to ever get a Jasper Carrot boom show?
It's funny. Noddy is the only member of Slade that I haven't interviewed on Choices, because I do this show every week on Boom called Choices, which is just a music and chat show. Um, and I've done all three other members of Slade, but not Noddy. So I really should make more of an effort to get hold of him and at least get him on Choices, shouldn't I?
Yeah, would you ever like him to do a one-off show on Boom if the
Oh,
opportunity
that would
arose?
be brilliant. It would be brilliant because I know he knows, he knows so many things about the music business,
Yeah,
and it'd be
and
fantastic.
someone mentioned to me as well. I'll tell you who should do a one-off show on Boom as well, probably as well as Noddy Holder as well. If ever you get a chance to get him, he's done a bit of radio. If ever you get a chance, and also I think personally, if ever you get a Lynn Parson, would be great on Boom as well.
Right. Well, all names gratefully received. But I never make any decisions on presenters. I pass all of that on to David. That's entirely his judgment. His
Brilliant, and it's a brilliant, fastest growing UK radio station, and you're doing a brilliant job. And keep it up. And
Thank you, Ben.
what what track is your guilty pleasure, and what track would you chuck in the dustbin of doom?
Oh, right. Guilty pleasure. Um, so the single that I love, and when I hear it on Boom, we do play it. I just melt. It was never a hit in the UK. Steve Wright used to play it. Steve was one of Steve's, um, not big, non-hits that should have been a hit, and I love it too. And it's Lamont Dozier, and Why Can't We Be Lovers? I'm a huge '70s soul music fan, and Lamont Dozier, of course, we play loads of Holland Dozier Holland stuff on Boom. But when Lamont did his own stuff in the '70s, that was the one. Why Can't We Be Lovers? What would I throw in the
Dustbin
dustbin of
of doom.
dustbin of doom? Crikey! I need to be careful because we play a very broad range of music on Boom, including tracks which I might personally not have selected if it was my playlist, but we still play them. Um, what would I what would I throw away? That's a very difficult one. I think it's it's difficult because no matter what you think about a song being bad, somebody will like it. And I think if you say, "Oh, I'm going to chuck that in the bin," then you're sort of offending somebody else's taste. So can I skip that one?
Yeah.
Um,
And what would you say to your 10-year-old self, and where do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
well, somebody sent me a picture of me as an 18-year-old in my first year at university. An old friend found this picture and sent it to me, and I did say to David, I sent him the picture because it was quite amusing, and I said, there I was back in 1977, first year at university, and I was probably playing Genesis and Kate Bush and David Essex and all the things we're still playing on Boom almost 50 years later. I wonder what I have said to myself as an 18-year-old. You'll still be playing this stuff when you're 66. I'm not sure whether I would have done, but there you go. I think I knew from a fairly early age when I was about 13 or 14 that I loved radio and wanted to get into it. And I think I probably would have said to myself, stick with it, kid. You'll have a great life.
Yeah. And the other name I forgot to mention as a potential Sean Boone before I ask you the last bit. Jasper Carrot, that's the name that was bobbing in my head.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You should get him to do a one-off special show at Boom for
Okay.
Boom and brilliant. And my last bit is what advice would you give to the next generation of radio people?
I think if you love radio, that's all that matters. There's so much opportunity out there to get onto radio and carve a career. You've just got to love it. I think I would recommend that they really listen hard to the great skilled, the really skilled people. Greg James, for example, is a brilliant broadcaster. Nick Ferrari on LBC, brilliant broadcaster. Scott Mills on Radio 2, brilliant broadcaster. So I'm not suggesting that they, just need to listen to young people. There are people all over. Nicky Horn on Boom is just brilliant in how he introduces records. So I think there are incredibly skilled broadcasters uh, working across the piece. And I would just say, if you really love radio, listen to how these guys do it, try and understand what they're doing, and then take that with you into your own career, whether it's in production, whether it's in presentation, whether it's in management, whatever it is that you end up doing. Um, but it's such a fantastic career. And radio is such a brilliant medium because with all of the technology around us, with all of the social media around us, there's still only radio, and probably on podcasting as well, it counts towards this, where you can talk to somebody one to one and you can have a relationship one to one with them and communicate in a human way with somebody without interfering in their lives. They can listen to you while they're driving the car, while they're going about their daily life. It's just a fantastic medium for talking and communicating and interacting one on one with people. And I can't see that ever changing. Radio is still huge medium, even with all of the other developments we've had in the 50 years since I started. It's still, 90% of the population is still listening to radio for 20 odd hours a week. Why is that? Because it just does something that nothing else can do. So it's just great.
Nice. Phil Riley, thank you for joining me here on Ben Lister Conversation today.
Thanks, Ben. Best of luck.
You're welcome. Don't forget this will be available in full as a podcast and the best bits right here on the Ben Lister Conversation radio show. Until next time, I'm sick of saying it. That's a wrap and back to the studio. Be all out. Bye bye.